that we've had our first anatomy lecture, we're going to introduce you to the Bridgman book. The Bridgman book you're going to have assignments out of every week, and usually it's around 10 drawings or so that you're going to have to do out of the book. And it's designed to teach you a few things. We've already sort of talked about that already, but we're going to really focus on the constructive quality that Bridgman utilizes to create the anatomy, as well as some of the simple shapes that he uses to create the idea of different anatomy. And on top of that, we're going to be introduced to this idea of line quality and rhythm within line that we haven't talked about so far. So far, everything we've done with line has been focused on minimizing its appearance and downplaying its qualities so that we can anticipate the shading aspect of finishing off a drawing. But when we look through Bridgman, we start to notice that line plays a large role in the creation of the drawings, not only in creating the shape, but also in creating the rhythm of the drawing. And we'll also see this important idea of how he can create the idea of volume just by the utilization of thick lines versus thin lines and the overlapping of some lines. And this isn't a new idea. This was written about long before Bridgman came along. But the nice thing is in these drawings we can see it very clearly. Even in something like this, we can see how the hand kind of tucks back behind the radius in that particular drawing. Or even something like this, the thenar of the thumb flowing into this tendon here, and then the tendons underneath are flowing behind it. So just this idea of this little line overlapping this line is starting to create more volume or form. Or even over here in this drawing of the thumb here, if we look at just our thumb and we're tempted to draw an outline, the outline could appear rather flat. But by having a few lines overlapping other lines, we can see that this bony phalange of the thumb is on top of or in front of the bulk of the thenar underneath here, and then the tip of the thumb is flowing out from underneath this portion of segment of the thumb. So the idea of overlapping, be it blatant like this or very, very subtle, is going to play a large part in our drawings coming up here. The idea being that as we develop an envelope and shadow map from now on, we can start to suggest a lot more three-dimensionality just by the subtle introduction of this idea of one line overlapping another line to suggest more form than we would otherwise get. And this is what's going to separate the look of your drawing from being sort of a diagram to being an actual drawing, something nice, not something that looks labored over or artificial or just like a block-in, but something that looks clean and refined. The other thing that we're going to learn with Bridgman is sort of how to think before we draw. You guys are going to be utilizing just a gel pen, and that's it, to do the drawings. So you will need to learn how to start light, and then as you develop confidence, go darker, and then learn how to absorb some of those pentimenti, those incorrect marks, into a thicker, more substantial line to create some of the varying thickness and the rhythm and quality within the line itself. So that's what we're going to focus on with Bridgman. Now I have here the book that I did my Bridgman copies out of the last time around that I did all of them. I decided to put them all in one book. And I did about two pages from this version of the Bridgman book, this 1999 edition, 2 pages of that book into 1 page of my book, and I'm working on an 11 by 14 here to do all of this. And I did all of the drawings as well as all of the text. It's not the first time I went through and did these drawings, but it's the first time I completed the entire book and put them all in one volume, and also included all of the text, just to better try to commit these to memory. But you'll notice that actually even in my book here, that the quality of the line actually improves greatly as the book progresses. So if we flip all the way to the beginning, I am getting some of the the rhythmic quality of the line, but it's a little more scratchy, a little less confident. But then as the drawings progress toward the end, the lines get firmer and stronger and cleaner. And there's a few things that will contribute to that. First of all, your understanding of the anatomy. If you spend more time looking at the muscles and knowing what it is you're seeing and sort of figuring out what it is you're looking at in the Bridgman book, then it's going to be easier to draw it more confidently. Secondly, one thing that can help you is working a little bit larger. So as we make some of the initial marks, we see that we're going to try to be as light as possible. But if we have to make multiple marks there to correct a single line or a single section, if we work large, we can combine those marks to create these thicker lines. And thicker lines don't look awkward on a large drawing. In fact, it's required on a larger drawing like this that the lines be of a heavier weight or a heavier thickness to read correctly, to look substantial. If you don't firm up the lines to get this nice thicker quality on a larger drawing, it's going to look too sketchy and too weak. So if we start too small and you have a lot of lines to merge together to get this nice solid line, you may end up with a tiny drawing with very, very fat lines. So instead, if we work a little bit larger, then all those mistakes can get absorbed, and when we figure them out, we can combine them into this nice solid line that varies a little bit in thickness as it goes throughout, but reads overall as a cleaner, more accurate line. So that's the goal. I don't want anybody starting in pencil. The idea here again is to do a lot more thinking before you start drawing. The idea is not to just copy them for the aesthetic sake of copying them, but copying them to start to help commit the idea of the forms to memory. So if you don't study the anatomy and you jump right into copying them, then you're sort of missing some of the point of the Bridgman here. They do have an aesthetic quality, there's no doubt about it, but it's going to be more relevant that you start to figure out what all of these shapes is that we're looking at and what are some of the forms that this anatomy can take. The other thing is you may have to decipher some of the Bridgman that you see and know which lines to reinforce and make a little thicker and more understandable, and which lines can be played down and just simply stated as sort of sketchy shading quality. Because ultimately, the idea is that your drawing should be clear, and in fact, they might end up being more clear than the Bridgman drawings themselves. Especially if you have a print quality of the Bridgman book that's not as clear as some of the older ones. The older the Bridgman book you get, the more clear each of the drawings will be. The more recent the Bridgman book, then we tend to have more sketchy, spotty lines where it almost looks like stippling connecting a line instead of a nice fluid line. So if you're working out of one of those newer books, you're going to need to firm up some lines, play down other lines, so that we can stress the parts of the anatomy that are most relevant for us to understand what we're looking at. For something like this, if we had the same amount of weight all the way around as we did in the outer lines here, which is describing the overall form, then it might not be as clear. Something like one of these drawings here. If the shading lines and the little detail lines of the nail were the same thickness as the outer exterior lines, well, then we wouldn't know quite as easily what we're looking at. The outer exterior lines would kind of blend with those detail lines, and it would get sort of chaotic. So knowing which lines to reinforce and which lines to play down will aid in our ability to quickly glance at a drawing and see, for example, that this is the outline of the pelvis, and then this is just some details within the pelvis. It's going to help us navigate and be understandable. So that's another goal here with Bridgman. So the first assignment, you're mostly focusing on the proportions of the figure here. And all of the drawings are listed in the Bridgman book. So if you have this Bridgman book here. I recommend you purchase it, The Complete Guide to Drawing from Life. It doesn't have to be this exact version, but The Complete Guide to Drawing from Life, for the most part, has the same page numbers throughout each edition. So pick up one of those. The assignments are listed in there. So the first assignment is mostly focused on getting the idea of this line quality down here, as well as some of the basic proportions of the human figure that we talked about in the lecture. But this is one particular page, 39, that is on the assignment, and it's the idea of these sort of rhythmic flowing lines. And notice that there is some varying line quality or thickness in here, and we need to try and capture that as we build it in. I suggest that actually you start with that page so that you can get the idea here of these lines. The way that we would proceed something like this, we get some ink flowing in here, and then we start to lightly, as light as we can with our gel pen. We want to use a gel pen, not a ballpoint pen. We lightly suggest the line we're trying to draw, in this case this one here. And at this stage, it only has to be a dark enough line for me to see. In fact, I want to play down its darkness to the viewer, because I'm going to build on top of it to actually do any corrections or finalize. So once I get the overall shape of this line here, if it's good, I can just go back in and start filling it in. And if there's any parts here that got a little scratchy due to corrections like this here, then I try to join those pieces to make a more solid line. You see again, since we're blowing up the size of this line so much, we have the ability to go a little thicker without it affecting its overall appearance. So, for example, if we were to reduce this curved line to the same size as the one here in the book, then it would bear about the same thickness, and that's ultimately what we're going for here. And we want to try to develop the ability to make this nice clean line. You know, we all have this tendency to start with the sketchy line, something like just a lot of little hatch lines like this to kind of seek out. And the problem with that is that your drawing can become sort of a little fuzzy looking. But it's fine to start out that way if you go light enough, because then we can come back in here and bring it all together. But you can't just leave it at that sketchy light stage. We have to actually come back and firm it up to be able to create something like this. This is a demo I did for one of the other classes. So practice a bunch of these lines here, all the ones in the book. See if you can get as close as you can to the shape, but also make sure they're nice clean lines that aren't really spotty or speckled. They should have nice flow, nice width about them. And then we'll just pick out a random one in here that we can do a demonstration of. Why don't we go towards the back here? The hand always makes some nice drawings. Bridgman has a lot of nice hands in here. So maybe we'll look at one of these hands. For the sake of the demonstration, we don't need to do one that's too complex. We do want to have some that has a nice amount of shape to it here. We do something like this hand here. So this is a drawing that's describing the extensors of the thumb here. Just extensor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis there. So we can, we'll start on this one here. Now again, I encourage you to blow these up a little bit. You don't have to be really precise about it, and you don't even have to really blow them up too much. The main point is that I don't want these to be sight size. I don't want you to be using any formal method. I don't want you to measure here and say, okay, now 2 times that is this for each one. You're totally missing the point if you end up doing that. You're just focusing then on copying the measurements, which is only one small part of it. You know, the major part is that you demonstrate this understanding of anatomy here. I do most of these when I'm sitting in a chair like this, or I did a lot of them just in bed actually. When we had our house in the mountains in the winter, and it was nice and cold, so we just cuddled up in bed, and I did drawings all day long. It took me, just to give you guys a frame of reference, it took me about a month to do the 1,000 drawings in here. And that was working probably 10 to 12 hours a day. 5 to 7 days a week, I can't recall exactly. So notice I am blocking this in, kind of sketchy, but mostly just light more than anything. And sort of seeking out the shapes here. You can take sort of visual plums, but the lighter you're able to start, the cleaner your drawing will end up. Ooh, see, that got heavy, so I'm probably going to have to commit to that line. One of the reasons we don't use a ballpoint pen is merely because the gel pen can go light, not quite as light as a ballpoint pen. A ballpoint pen can go super, super light. But the gel pen doesn't have the range of shading that a ballpoint pen can exhibit. So it is much more like a pen and ink to utilize a gel point pen versus a ballpoint pen, which is almost like a non-erasable graphite or charcoal pencil in the way it can be handled. And also the thickness that we can get out of a gel pen is pretty solid. You can get a nice thick line that has a varying flow of ink to it and get that nice rhythm quality out of it, which is a lot harder to do with a ballpoint pen. Thinking about these shapes here. Always thinking about the anatomy. I want to understand what all this anatomy is. The main focus of this drawing is the extensors, but also the rigid nature of the thumb. You want to understand the bones versus the pads in the thumb. That gives the thumb its nice, rugged, dynamic quality. It's like we're drawing some bones here. We're ignoring the fingers in favor of just bones, which is nice. I'll just take this kind of a level over from my thumb knuckle over to my first finger knuckle there. And you know, it is good to consider the Bridgman drawings are so stylistic. I mean, the anatomy is there, the overall shapes are there, and the line quality is beautiful, but they are very much to agree stylized versus when you look at the Vanderpool anatomy, excluding maybe some of the features. The Vanderpool anatomy is quite a bit more natural, but we have to consider Vanderpool is more like an observational type of drawing. This is more of a constructive type of drawing. You know, even the old academies, this is how they would think about anatomy when they were constructing their figures. And then they would use these ideas, and this constructive ideas, and even some of this rhythmic quality and angularity to create their paintings conceptually, and then even to modify the model to some degree. I mean, if you look at the paintings of Solomon, there's some real rhythmic, dynamic quality in the hands and the torso anatomy in some of his paintings that really is reminiscent of these drawings in here. And there's something that if you were purely an observational painter, you might skip some of that and miss some of the dynamic qualities, gestural qualities that are potential in a human, and make something that looks a little flatter in your painting. Whereas this can push you to get some of those stronger rhythms and angularities. And even, Rockwell, who came from the same school of thought, Rockwell studied under Bridgman here. Rockwell said that to create energy, some degree of exaggeration is necessary. And so the goal is to study this and study these older texts and drawings and figure out what is the maximum range you can exaggerate on something you're observing, and keep it looking believable and natural, but also pushing that idea of drama and action within it. So you can see I've landed enough of my preliminary marks on here where I can come back and be a little more confident as I throw in these little smaller pieces of anatomy and bring together some of these lines that I've drawn. Here we see an example of the tucking or the overlapping, that extensor overlapping a little bit the knuckle on the back side here. And then the knuckle here overlapping a little bit that next segment, which overlaps a little bit the thumb nail. So all of this little overlapping gives us the idea that the thumb is stepping down as it's bending out, as opposed to merely just a flat outline. That's what we're looking for here in our line drawings. The line drawing can be a very beautiful thing if we can introduce some of these rhythmic and variety qualities to it. So these Bridgman drawings would take me anywhere between 10 minutes and 30 minutes, depending on the complexity of the drawing. And of course, I haven't done these in quite a while, so except for my demonstrations. So I'm not quite as speedy as I once was. But keep in mind, you'll gain speed as you do these more often. When you first do them, they're going to be very slow, and it's not uncommon for students to spend more along the lines of 45 minutes to an hour in the beginning, just being very careful and sort of figuring out how to navigate the materials and etc. And then once you get a little more knowledgeable at it, a little more confident at it, you'll be able to knock these out not only higher quality but faster. This particular section of the book, the hands, we get to in week 4. So you have one, and then once we get to it, you have 2 weeks to actually complete those particular drawings. So you end up with enough time to do these and hopefully make them quite nice, and hopefully develop a good skill set in doing these before we even get to this section. So you can really take advantage of these nice, beautiful drawings. I will encourage everyone in here to do all of these drawings. The amount listed in the textbook is only 80 Bridgman drawings, and this book contains over 1,000. And you have to consider that most artists, or at least portrait or figure artists, have executed these drawings more than once. And it's not always just Bridgman. Every artist has gone to school or learned via one textbook or the other. Some really prefer Vanderpool, some prefer Bridgman, some prefer Loomis. There's a lot of different options out there, but the point is, if you want to get really good, you need to be studying these obsessively. And a lot of artists I've talked to would say how when they were in school, at lunch they would just pop out their books and start doing copies again and again and again. I think Scott Burdick was even telling me that he would do a lot of Vanderpool studies, a lot of Vanderpool drawings over and over and over, doing tons of Vanderpool drawings when he was in school. That's how you start to commit some of these forms to memory and get better at the line quality and also become more sensitive to observation. It's a great way to improve your game, even more so in some cases than going to an open studio. I've seen people going to open studios for years. Even at the Palette and Chisel, there have been some people who had been there for decades, and they haven't significantly improved their ability to do portrait or figure. But then again, they never did any of these studies. They never tried to see the figure or the portrait through the eyes of Vanderpool or the eyes of Bridgman. It's sort of like they're shooting in the dark to try and master this really complex art form without having any guidance. And this is your guidance right here. And I tell students this all the time. Eventually, you're going to leave this academy. You're going to leave me, and you have the option of continually going from instructor to instructor to instructor in hopes of always having somebody who can kind of pick up the pieces and point you in the right direction and correct your mistakes. Or you can learn from the masters that came before us. That's why we do master copies. That's why we do these drawings. Because we want to be able to look for Bridgman to help. We want to study this enough so that these artists become our teacher. And that's where we find the solutions to our questions, and that's how we push our skills further. So instead of maybe just going to Open Studio every week and repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, why not try to just work your way through these drawings? They don't all... These aren't going to take 3 or 6 hours like an open studio drawing. You can do one of these in 30 minutes or an hour, and you can learn something from it and savor it. Take as much out of it as you can. So hopefully next time you go to open studio, your skills are pushed a little further. Same is true for any of these, Vanderpool or Loomis or any of those. Do the drawings. Do yourself a favor. Do the drawings. Do them a lot. Do them obsessively until when you set yourself in front of the open studio, your brain will start to connect the dots. You'll look at a hand and start to think, oh yeah, I remember what Bridgman said about how the segments line up over the pads, and I need to make sure that my knuckles are spaced differently because that middle finger knuckle is a little further ahead. And so then you start to pay attention to these little subtle things that's going to increase the overall accuracy and beauty of your drawing. That's why we're doing these. Doing so many of these drawings. So I encourage you to do more. Do more than just the bare minimum here. The bare minimum is what I feel is the least I can have you do with you having a vague understanding of what it is you're looking at, so that when we do start to look at figure in depth next term, you're not completely lost. But in all reality, the true assignment should be to copy all of these, and not only just once, again and again. I understand we have time concessions that we have to make, but that's being an artist. That's going to school, learning. If you want to be a doctor, we have to commit quite a bit of information to memory, and we can't just say, I don't quite have the time to do it, I'll do it later. We have to find the time. The more you're able to sacrifice time-wise and commit to this sort of stuff, quite frankly, the better the artist you'll end up being. It's a direct cause and effect. And unfortunately, that is the one thing I haven't been able to figure out a solution to get around for my students. Just going over some of these last lines here, cleaning them up, making them look a little more fluid. If they deviate a little from some of these lines, it's not a huge deal. A confidently placed line tends to trump a timidly placed, more accurate line. Alright, that should be about it.